The first sound wasn't the breeze. It was a cry that never stopped. Caleb Morgan reined in his mare near the parched riverbed. The Nevada sun beat down like justice itself. Heat rippled across the desert plain, the air heavy with grit and buzzing insects. Then he saw it. A figure dangling from a sycamore limb, swaying gently in the wind. Not gone, not yet. The woman's hands were bound high above her head, her toes barely brushing the earth. Her gown torn, her hair matted with sweat and sand. For a moment, Caleb thought it was an illusion, another harsh trick of the summer blaze. But when the breeze turned, he heard it, a sound that sliced right through him. A low, ragged gasp. He leapt from his mare and ran. The closer he got, the grimmer it was. The rope had bitten deep into her wrists, blood trickling down her pale arms. Her lips were chapped, her eyes half-lidded, unfocused, staring at nothing. A sign was nailed to the tree trunk, the letters seared with a branding iron. Folks in Calvert had grown wary lately, ever since the minister started preaching about evil walking among women. When he spoke, they listened. Fear, it turns decent folks cruel. Witch. Caleb swore under his breath. He sliced the rope with his pocket knife, catching her just before she hit the ground. Her body was limp, light as a child's. She tried to speak, but only a murmur escaped. Water. He poured from his flask, slow, careful, letting the drops fall onto her tongue. She flinched at first, then swallowed, like someone remembering how to breathe again. He tore a strip from his shirt to bind her wrists, then glanced around. The tree stood solitary in the vast emptiness, miles from town. Whoever did this, they hadn't wanted her found. Her eyes flickered open again. They were hazel, clouded with pain and something heavier, shame. They called me dangerous, her voice cracked, said I was touched by darkness. Caleb frowned. Who said that? The minister. The word lingered between them like a storm cloud. Caleb lifted her gently onto his mare, wrapping her in his jacket. As he turned toward the horizon, he looked back once. The tree still swayed, empty now, but the shadow beneath it, it seemed to hold her ghost. He didn't know who she was or what the town had done to her, but as the sun bled crimson over the desert, one thought kept searing his mind. What kind of minister would call a woman cursed just to see her swing? Caleb rode hard until the light began to dim. The woman in his arms barely stirred, her head resting against his chest, her breathing faint and uneven. The trail stretched endless under the fading sun, the sagebrush bending like waves of silver. When they reached the first gatepost of his homestead, the horses neighed in relief. Dust swirled behind them as he called toward the stable. "Rosa, fetch water and clean rags." The old housekeeper hurried out, her apron brushing the porch steps. She froze when she saw the girl, her face tightening with silent shock. Merciful heavens, what have they done to her? "Just help me," Caleb said softly. Inside the homestead, the air smelled of cedar soap and aged timber. The girl shivered as Rosa cleaned her wrists, the water running red before turning clear. Caleb handed over a tin of ointment, the kind used for soothing burns. She winced, but didn't pull away. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, eyes darting up at him like a trapped sparrow. "Clara? All right, Clara, you're safe here." She gave a faint smile, one that almost seemed like disbelief. For the next week, she drifted between fever and nightmares, sometimes waking in the dark, gasping for air. Once, Caleb found her weeping, whispering about the tree. He sat by her bed until dawn, saying nothing, just staying there. After that first week, she slept in the guest room, drifting less each night. On the 10th evening, she woke to find him repairing a saddle by the window. "You should have left me," she whispered. "The town. They said I was cursed." He looked up, steady, calm. I don't heed towns. That made her laugh. Once, dry and brittle, but real. Later, she shared fragments of the truth. The minister, Ezekiel Holt, had cornered her in the church pantry. When she resisted, he claimed she'd gone wild, said darkness spoke through her. And the people, too scared to question God's man, they believed him. Caleb stayed silent for a long while, his jaw tight. Then he asked one simple question. Would you swear on your mother's grave that what you're saying is true? Clara met his eyes without wavering. I'd swear on my soul. He nodded. Then, we'll find proof. That night the wind wailed around the homestead, carrying the cries of coyotes and distant thunder. Clara stood by the window, watching the lantern light flicker on the stable wall. For the first time since that awful day, her hands didn't tremble. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere in town, the minister had learned she was alive, and he wasn't praying for her safety. By the end of the week, Clara had color in her cheeks again. She could walk without aid, though her arms still bore faint rope scars. Caleb pretended not to notice how she touched them sometimes, like checking if they were still real. One morning a dust cloud rose on the horizon. Sam, Caleb's young ranch hand, came riding fast from town, his hat nearly blowing off. He leapt from his horse, breathless. Sir, there's talk in Calver. Folks say the minister's spreading word, you stole that girl. Caleb's eyes darkened. Stole? Sam nodded. He told them she escaped from a sick house. Said you took her in for sin. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale again. Caleb turned to her, voice calm but heavy. We're not hiding anymore. That night he sat by the fire with a map and a plan. The only way to end this was to show people the truth. He sent Sam back to town under cover of darkness, told him to ask questions about the missing girls, and to watch who the minister met with. 2 days later, Sam returned. His face said everything before his words did. There's a ledger under the church floor. I saw it when Holt opened the cellar. And there's something else. He meets a trader from Carson City, one with a wagon marked with red paint. I heard the trader say the words, "Next delivery." Caleb's jaw tightened. Delivery of what? Sam hesitated, glancing at Clara. Women. The room went silent. The fire cracked once, sharp as a gunshot. Caleb stood, his shadow long against the wall. Then, we'll ride tonight. They reached the church near midnight. The moon hung low, pale as bone. The place was quiet, except for the wind through the steeple. Inside, the air smelled of wax and decay. Clara pointed to the pulpit. There, she whispered. Caleb pried up the boards beneath. A wooden chest waited. Getting there hadn't been easy. The cellar door was bolted. Caleb worked the rusted latch with his knife while the wind outside masked the faint scrape of metal. For a moment, they thought a shadow moved by the window, but it was only the cross, swaying in the draft. Inside were folded letters, coins, ribbons, and one small braid of hair. Clara's hands shook as she touched it. That belonged to Mary. She was only 16. Caleb found the ledger. pages filled with names, numbers, and the minister's signature beside every missing girl. It was the proof they needed. They barely made it out before dawn as they rode back toward the homestead. The first light touched the horizon. Caleb looked over his shoulder at the church shrinking behind them. He said quietly, "The law will see this. And if the law won't, I will." Back at the homestead, Clara stood by the fence, holding the braid in her palm. Her voice was soft, but sure. "He called me cursed, Caleb. But maybe now, he's the one who'll face judgment." He nodded, staring toward town. The wind carried the faint chime of a church bell. Only this time, it didn't sound sacred. It sounded like a warning.
So, what'll happen when the minister finds out what they took from under his floor? Take a sip of tea, lean back, and tell me what time it is where you're listening from. And if you love stories of the Old West and true hearts that won't break, hit subscribe and stay with me for what comes next. Morning came heavy with dust and heat, the kind that made the air taste like iron. Caleb saddled his mare in silence, while Clara packed the ledger and letters into a small bag. They both knew this day wouldn't end quiet. Days earlier, Sam had slipped a folded note to a passing ranger near the trade road, praying it would reach Fort Duncan before the minister made his move. By noon, riders appeared on the trail. The minister was in front, his black coat flapping in the wind, 3 men riding close behind him, rifles across their saddles. His face was pale, twisted with fury. "You stole from the house of God," he shouted, "and now you'll pay for it." Caleb stepped forward from the porch, his stance calm but solid as stone. "You mean the house you turned into a market for sin?" The minister's hand twitched near his holster. "Careful what you say, rancher. The Lord doesn't forgive liars." "Then I reckon you're out of luck," Caleb said. Clara stood beside him, her chin high, the bag clutched tight. The men dismounted, spreading out like coyotes, but before a single step reached the porch, the sound of hooves thundered from the north. 5 more riders approached, Nevada Rangers, their silver badges glinting in the sunlight. The lead ranger raised his voice. "Minister Ezekiel Holt, you are under arrest for abduction, fraud, and unlawful trade of persons." The minister froze, color draining from his face. "This is sacrilege." The ranger held up the ledger. "No, this is evidence." For a moment, the world went still. Then one of the minister's men panicked, reaching for his gun. A single shot rang out. Caleb's bullet hit the ground, inches from the man's boot. Dust sprayed up like warning smoke. "Nobody dies today unless he wants to," Caleb said evenly. The rangers closed in. The minister's eyes darted, desperate, searching for a way to twist the truth one last time. But when a woman from town rode up holding a faded ribbon that once belonged to her daughter, his mouth finally went still. They shackled him and led him away through the dust. Some townsfolk watched from the ridge, whispering. A woman who once worked at the church pressed her hands to her mouth, whispering Clara's name like an apology. An old rancher turned away, muttering he'd known something was wrong all along. A few crossed themselves. Others just looked down. Clara stood there as the last wagon rolled out of sight. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange weight of freedom. She looked at Caleb and said softly, "It's over, isn't it?" He shook his head. "Not yet. You still have to forgive yourself." That night, the homestead was quiet again. Firelight danced across the wooden walls, soft and warm. Clara sat by the window watching the stars blink over the desert. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled, like a song for the living. She whispered to herself, almost afraid of the words. Maybe peace was always this quiet. But out beyond the hills, where the road curved back toward Calver, a single lantern still burned inside the church house. Someone had returned. The lantern swayed slowly, casting long shadows on the pews, as if someone inside was still searching for what had been taken. And they weren't there to pray. Weeks passed, and the dust began to settle. The minister was gone, taken to Fort Duncan for trial. Folks in town started talking different. Some whispered guilt, some spoke shame, and a few finally spoke the truth out loud. Clara stayed at the homestead, not because she had nowhere to go, but because, for the first time, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The house smelled of sage and coffee every morning. She helped Rosa bake cornbread, learned how to mend harness straps. She even laughed again, soft at first, then louder, like music she'd forgotten she knew. Caleb watched her from the porch sometimes. He never said much, but his eyes held the quiet pride of a man who'd seen life take and give in equal measure. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mesa, Clara brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "They'll forget about me soon," she said, watching the horizon glow. He smiled faintly. "Good. Then you can start remembering yourself." She nodded, letting the silence stretch between them, peaceful and whole. When spring came, wildflowers bloomed near the riverbank where he'd first stopped his mare that terrible day. Clara planted a small patch herself, bright yellow against the red earth. She said it was for the girls who never made it home and for every soul who'd ever been called broken. Caleb built a fence around that patch, not to keep it safe, but to mark it sacred. Some nights, she still woke from dreams of the sycamore tree, her hands reaching for air. But now, there was always light in the room, always the soft sound of horses breathing in the stable outside. And every time, she'd whisper the same words before falling back to sleep. "I made it." The town learned too. They learned that silence can be as cruel as any rope, and that sometimes justice rides on the back of one quiet man who refuses to look away. Some folks spend a lifetime learning that doing right don't always feel easy. Now, tell me something. Have you ever been judged before you had the chance to speak? And if you had, would you have the courage to stand again, like Clara did? Maybe we all have a bit of her in us, the part that fights to be seen, the part that chooses love over fear. So take a breath, sip your tea, and think about it. What would you have done if you were Caleb, riding past that day? If this story stirred something in you, give it a like so others can find it too. And subscribe if you believe the world still needs stories that remind us of mercy, courage, and second chances. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one person who decides to stop and look closer.